All right, thank you, Representative Hausman. I was born and raised here in Austin, so I'm sure I won't be the last person to, again, welcome you to our lovely city, and thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to talk to you today about mileage fees. Now, I really don't know how much any of you know about this topic, so I've tried to keep it rather high level, but hopefully it's not going to bore you too much. What I want to talk about is basically what they are, what has been going on in the study of mileage fees, and where we may be going, and what I think you and fellow policymakers need to know about this topic. So first off, what exactly are we talking about? Well, at the most simple level, mileage fees are just charging for travel, not fuel consumption. The major source of funding at the federal and state level are fuel taxes. Well, the fact is, fuel taxes charge you for the fuel you consume, not how far you drive. And what mileage fees would do is essentially take fuel consumption out of the equation and make it so that you pay for what you use. Now, these go by many different names. You've probably seen a lot of these acronyms before. Mileage-based user fees, the MBUF. There's actually a mileage-based user fee alliance that is out right now trying to generate support for this concept. Vehicle miles traveled fee is a little more technical, but it is still used quite a bit. Time, distance, place charging is used by a lot of economists because they think that it more accurately captures the full charging potential of mileage fees, as you can charge a differential price based on the time of day. Here in Texas, we've called them vehicle mileage fees, just a little bit simpler. They've also been called road user fees. You may see that referenced at the federal level. And internationally, we have road user charges. Just for simplicity, I will stick with the term mileage fee for today, but just know that when I say mileage fee, it means all of these other things too. Now, why are we studying mileage fees? Well, Mr. Bass did an excellent job of framing the current funding and financing crisis that we have right now. And the fact is, a lot of people think that mileage fees could address some of these issues. Now, one of the problems we have is that our system is dependent on fuel taxes. And fuel taxes are an excise tax. It's a tax on the physical amount of fuel. That means that no matter what the price of fuel is, it's still returning the same amount of revenue. It's still returning the same amount of money back to the federal government. And the fact is, we've got a lot of policies in place that are encouraging people to drive more fuel-efficient vehicles. And in fact, the ever-escalating price of fuel itself is driving people into more fuel-efficient vehicles. So the fact is, we've got a revenue base right now that is, we have a transportation system that is dependent on a revenue base that we are pretty much being discouraged from consuming. Mileage-based fees, of course, might address some of these issues. If you're charging based on travel, well, it doesn't matter if your car gets 50 miles to the gallon or 15 miles to the gallon, or if you're driving an electric vehicle where you don't burn fuel at all. If you drive 20 miles, you are going to pay for 20 miles. And the fact is, mileage fees can do a lot of other things too. We can use them for system management, and that's something that's very popular in the tolling industry to talk about these days, is the potential to perhaps have charges that vary based on the time of day so that you can discourage people from driving, during rush hour. Another issue might be environmental pricing. In areas that are, for example, non-attainment for certain air quality, for air quality, you could perhaps levy a higher per mile charge. It's possible. And just better revenue allocation. Again, Mr. Bass highlighted the apportionment formulas that dictate how much money we get. Well, imagine how much easier that would be if we actually had mileage data for every driver in the nation. So it might help us better allocate revenue. And finally, the last reason that that it's really good to study is that there are lots of different ways to implement them. They don't have to be technology dependent. You can actually do a mileage fee with no technology at all. There's lots of different ways to assess mileage. Do you use data from inside the vehicle, or do you just stick a device in there that gets GPS signals? What about integration with legacy systems? How do we bring the DMV into this? So there's lots of questions going on right now, and this is pretty much the reason why we're looking at that. As you can see, the interest in this subject, it's pretty popular. There's a lot of states looking at it. I'm going to go over these in a little more detail here in a few minutes. The red dots, those were the first three major studies of the mileage fee concept, and I want to talk about them just a little bit more. The Puget Sound Regional Council, Oregon Department of Transportation, and University of Iowa, these were all generally the first three. This is the first generation of the mileage fee pilot. Now, what all three of these did was that they developed a single technology solution for metering road usage. They developed a single system for calculating a fee. They developed a single back office solution, and they developed a single payment method. So as one sort of, each one of these tested sort of one single little proprietary package, if you will. And basically they were just interested in, is this even a good idea? Is this something that would really even be feasible? There were slight differences in how they did it. Puget Sound was actually more interested in looking at how drivers behave to tolling. They wanted to see, well, if we have a different price for this road versus this road, well, what are travelers going to do? Oregon Department of Transportation was more interested in looking at, well, can we build a system where we would charge people mileage, but they would pay just like they do with the fuel tax. All right, and University of Iowa had a similar system to Oregon, but they were interested in developing sort of an invoicing. They wanted to be able to assess mileage and then develop an invoicing system where people could pay, for things online and that matter. So I want to talk real quick about what Oregon actually did. Again, this was sort of the first big. This was the first big one of those three. Now, what they did was they had an in-vehicle device. Is that right? Right there. That connected to the onboard diagnostic port. Through that connection, this device received start and stop and speed data from the engine, and it used that to actually determine how far the vehicle had traveled. So, as the participants are driving, this unit is also getting location data from GPS satellites. Now, the only thing this unit would know is whether the mileage, whether the car was in Oregon or outside of Oregon. That was really all that it knew. They had a map inside. It would get the GPS signals, and the unit was pretty much able to say, okay, we're either in Oregon or we're not. They didn't know what road you were traveling on. They didn't really know the municipality. They didn't know what type of road. That was really all it was collecting, because they wanted to be able to charge only for in-state mileage. Now, whenever a pilot participant would refuel their vehicle, these little wireless devices at participating fuel stations would then read the mileage data, would transmit that mileage data through the service station's point-of-sale software. It would go back to ODOT, where a fee would be calculated. The fee would be sent back to the service station. It would be affixed to the fuel purchase. They would then take the fuel tax off the fuel bill. All right, so they were testing, so because it was a fuel tax replacement, and then it would basically clear the unit, and the person would keep driving. All right, so that was Oregon's system, and again, it basically showed that you can do this. Now, we're moving in now to the second generation of pilot tests. What these are what the next round of studies are really focused on is how do we actually put these things on the ground. All right, now Oregon is still leading the charge. They figured out that it's probably not going to work having one technology solution, one proprietary closed system. So what they're doing is they're actually testing. They're going to do another pilot where it's only going to use electric vehicles, and the participants are going to have a range of assessment options. They can do a simple odometer reading. They can submit to a mileage assessment through various in-vehicle technology. I think they have 3 different options, and one of them is actually state-run. There's 2 private sector-run assessment options, and then one is run by ODOT. So they have a wide range of choices for their participants. Now, Minnesota, and I'm sure the representative could probably correct me if I say anything wrong about this one, but Minnesota is actually interested in looking at whether you can do a mileage fee system using just sort of off-the-shelf technology, and they're looking specifically at using GPS-enabled smartphones. And I'll talk about that one here in just a minute, because this one's very interesting. Nevada, after these first round of pilots, said, you know what, we've talked to our people, we really don't like this idea of even using location technology at all. So what Nevada is actually doing right now is they've got a field test where they have equipment that is simply reading the mileage from the odometer itself and then basically doing a pay at the pumps. And they're basically testing a lower functionality version of the Oregon pilot, because they're more interested in simply collecting money, and they don't even want to touch the location and the privacy issue. I-95 Corridor Coalition, well, they're actually leaving the technology assessment to everybody else. What they're interested in is looking at multi-state coordination issues. again, as I was mentioning before, how do we make all the different DMVs connect? What are the legal issues? What are the issues related to if you're going to be using technology to assess fees? Well, you know, will that stand up in court? How do you certify technology? So they're looking at sort of these institutional issues. And then finally, New York City, which will be issuing an RFP. I think they already had an RFI out. They should be doing an RFP soon. What they're looking to do is actually build a traveler information service of which mileage fees would only be one little tiny part. All right, what they want to do is they want to build a system in New York City where drivers can get routing information, travel time information, perhaps do pay-as-you-drive or usage-based insurance. Basically, an information system for travelers that would provide all these different services of which you could then use that data to do a mileage fee. The mileage fee would just be a little tiny part of the overall system. So again, what we're seeing here is how do we actually get these systems on the ground? And all of these are ongoing right now. I think Minnesota is going to be wrapping up here pretty soon, I believe. Now let's talk about that one just real quick. As I said, they are using cell phones. Now, what you see here is one of the smartphones that they are using is a Samsung Galaxy, excuse me. They're using it because it's based, the operating system is Google, so they can work with it a little easier than they could with an iPhone. And they're also using cloud-based. They're using Microsoft Azure cloud-based cloud system to do all the back office processing. And anyway, what they're doing is these cell phones are going into the cars. They give all the participants these cell phones. Now, all the functionality has been taken off the phone, all right? They know that they can't have people driving around with these phones attached to the dashboard. So all these phones do is run the min.mileage fee application. That's it, all right? But they're just, again, interested in just seeing if this would work. The phone communicates with this little dongle that connects to the onboard diagnostic port, and that basically verifies that the phone is in the right car. The thinking being that on down the line, you wouldn't want to have a fee system that was tied to your phone, because then if you get in somebody else's car, well, you might get charged for that mileage. So basically, they're using this little device right here to verify that the phone is in the right car. Now, what is most interesting to me about the Minnesota pilot is the policy assumption underlying the system design here. The basic policy assumption is that in the future, if Minnesota were to do a mileage fee, the base level, the base assessment would be a simple odometer reading. They're assuming that in the future, they're going to do an odometer reading. And that's how it's going to be. No technology. That's it. You get your odometer read once a year, or however periodically. And the technology would, in fact, be a discounting mechanism. For example, if you drive into Wisconsin quite a bit, or you do a lot of interstate travel, you would then use the phone to discount the mileage over your odometer reading. That's a very interesting policy assumption. I think it's something very useful to consider when looking at implementing these systems. Now, what have all these pilots told us? Now, there's lots of different ways to assess these, and they're all pretty much viable. You know, the technology's out there. If you talk to any technology vendor about this, you tell them what you want to do, they're going to figure out a way to do it. Another thing that we've seen, particularly with the Oregon pilot and University of Iowa, is that people tend to get more comfortable with the idea the more they're exposed to it. The more people use the system, the more they're comfortable with it. And that doesn't mean that everybody who's used it has liked it. There's always going to be folks who don't like the technology, but in general, folks would get more comfortable with it. And hopefully, New York will be showing us that mileage fees can be deployed in conjunction with other types of transportation services like routing, travel time. However, there's still a lot of questions that need to be answered. I think I've touched on a few of those, but I think what you've all probably yes? Oh. Those were all states. So what's going on at the federal level? Right now, there's only one study going on at the federal level, and basically, they're just looking at the different technologies that might be used in doing a mileage fee system. And the thing is, I don't think there's going to be any other federally funded mileage fee studies coming anytime soon. There is no language for mileage fee study in MAP 21. However, maybe that will change. On the left, you see a quote from Congressman Chip Craddock from Minnesota. He was instrumental in getting the language and basically thwarting mileage fees from being in MAP 21. And he summed up a lot of what we've heard in our focus groups which is that mileage fees are a creepy level of government intrusion into our vehicle and personal lives. However, just this past week, I have heard that. I'm not going to comment on that. But the incoming House Transportation Committee chairman just this week said that he thinks basically that VMT fees, again, see that different term, are definitely worth looking at. So maybe there'll be some movement on this in the future. I'm not really sure. I'm not much of a political junkie. So we'll see. However, even if it does get going at the federal level, there's a huge issue of public acceptance. And in fact, I would argue that's the biggest barrier right now to these discussions and moving this concept forward. Now at TTI, we've identified four major areas of public acceptance, four major public acceptance challenges. The first being just simple fairness, all right? I mean, it's just, we're talking about a new tax, and people don't like new taxes. It just doesn't seem fair. And of course, fairness is in the eye of the beholder. But we often hear this, we've heard this fairness argument articulated in terms, A, of rural drivers, because they have to drive further. So it's seen as punitive to rural drivers or people that have to drive for a living. And secondly, it's also seen as punitive to people who are driving more fuel-efficient vehicles now. I mean, the fact is we have CAFE standards, and that sends a signal to people that government wants them to drive more fuel-efficient vehicles. Well, now we're turning around and saying, well, actually, you're part of the problem, and we're going to levy a new fee on you because of these responsible decisions you make. And that just doesn't sit well with a lot of folks, and it strikes people as being unfair. Now, obviously, privacy is one of the big issues, and that tends to get expressed in terms of active tracking, like you're going to be driving around and some bureaucrat will be sitting at a monitor watching where you go, or that they're going to store that data and use it against you at a later date. All right, so that's a very big concern that needs to be addressed. And there's also concerns about data privacy. With the fuel tax right now, we don't collect any information on anybody. The government really doesn't know if you're paying your fuel taxes. But what we're talking about here is collecting fees from every single driver, having to keep information on them. Well, who's going to have that data? How are you going to keep it safe? That is a big concern among the public. Third, administrative cost. Again, folks, there is no real, people don't have a face-to-face interaction with the folks that are ultimately collecting the fuel tax. All right, but they recognize that with mileage fees, we're looking at having to develop a lot of new functionality and a lot of new bureaucracy. And to the public, it doesn't make sense to build this big, new, expensive system to replace something that's actually relatively cheap and easy. All right, and the other thing is, how are they going to have to pay for this? Right now, the fuel tax is very good because people, a lot of times, don't even know they're paying it. It gets paid with your fuel purchases. They don't have to think about it. But what we're talking about here is something where you might have to pay another bill, you know, once a month or however often, and folks don't like that. We don't want to have to pay something else. And finally, there's this issue of enforcement. All right, fuel taxes, kind of hard to evade. If you're going to drive, you got to buy fuel, and you're going to have to pay your fuel taxes. These look very easy to evade, and folks are just pretty skeptical that anybody is going to be able to really enforce this, and that's just going to drive up this administrative cost. Now, I could stand up here and tell you lots of different strategies for perhaps addressing these issues. You know, we could probably, all of us come up with a pretty good system, but the fact is, one of the big issues we have right now, we have an education and an enthusiasm gap on the public. The fact is the public does not really understand how we pay for infrastructure. When we've done focus groups, we ask people, how do you think we pay for roads? Now, folks will say taxes, but they don't know that it's fuel taxes. And then when you have a conversation with the fuel tax, about the fuel tax, folks don't know that it's not a sales tax. They don't know these things, all right? And when you start talking about threats to the long-term sustainability, when you start talking about the threat from fuel-efficient vehicles, all right, when you start talking about inflation, well, that's really kind of esoteric, and it's not as important as the other stuff. I mean, we're talking about health care, right, and we've still got things going on in the Middle East, and you want to talk about imposing new transportation taxes. It just doesn't really register high on people's list of important things that government should be working on. And the fact is, it gets really hard to make the case for change when people don't even know how the current system works. We're talking about a big new, potentially expensive, potentially intrusive tax system, to replace something that people didn't even really know was there. All right, so it's a very difficult case to make. All right, so I've probably laid out a fairly grim assessment of where we're going on this, but I think there is a future. So let me just close with a few brief comments on where I think this is headed. First off, the fuel tax is not going anywhere, and really raising fuel taxes and indexing them, that's probably the best short-term solution. All right, we're still going to be driving internal combustion engines for a very long time. And in fact, electric vehicles and hybrids make up a very small part of the overall vehicle fleet. Department of Energy really doesn't think they're going to be making a dent anytime soon in the vehicle fleet. The fuel tax is cheap and easy to collect. It's only collected from a few fuel distributors. We're not collecting it from every single person. So in the short term, fuel tax is going to be staying. Second of all, if you're looking to generate support for the mileage fee concept, equity and fairness, that's the most salient issue. The fact is, funding shortfalls, they don't click with the public. If you start talking about how we're underinvesting in transportation and how we need to have money for maintenance and expense, you're only going to get into an argument about how the DOT spends money. People are just going to say, well, the DOT, if they spent the money better, this wouldn't be an issue. All right? The real salient issue is equity and fairness. What we've seen in our focus groups is that when you start talking about the fact that electric vehicles don't pay anything, well, hey, that seems like a good that seems like a good group of vehicles to target mileage fees. That's what we see in our focus groups, and that's actually what Oregon has seen. That's why they're looking to do their pilot on electric vehicles. They found that that's a really easy case to make. So really, emphasizing fairness is probably the best way moving forward if you're going to generate support for this. Third, in the event that we do finally get around to doing a mileage fee system, it is really unlikely that the government is going to be able to force anybody to install anything in their vehicle. All right, first off, technology is really not necessary. As I said earlier, technology really should be presented as a discounting mechanism. And the fact is, if the government's going to mandate anything in vehicles, it's going to be safety-based applications. If you've heard about the connected vehicle study going on, University of Michigan, as soon as that equipment starts getting mandated for new vehicles, that's when you maybe start thinking about mileage fees becoming a reality. And let's also face it, in-vehicle telematics, within 20 or 30 years, everybody's vehicle may be generating the data to do a mileage fee without having to install anything. We don't know what it's going to look like. And one more thing, there's going to have to be a paradigm shift in how we view transportation. All right, and I think we're seeing that right now. You know, I grew up in the 90s. You know, the internet was just getting started. But the fact is, even then, a vehicle, that was my means of connecting with my friends, getting out of the house. That was my networking instrument, my networking tool. I was able to get out of the house. But the fact is, that's less important today. We have, you know, social networks. We have, you know, kids have cell phones. It's becoming less important. We're seeing the growth in vehicle sharing, particularly in urban areas. It's just not necessary to have a vehicle. What about autonomous vehicles? Is it going to be as important for people to be able to get in their car and be physically in control of the vehicle, or are drivers in the future going to be content just to get it? The vehicle will be an instrument to get them from place to place. It won't be a tool of personal expression, you know, personal freedom. And we're already seeing declines in driver's licensing among youth. A recent National Highway Household Travel Survey has shown that the percentage of 16 and 17-year-olds with a driver's license actually dropped between 2000 and 2010. And there's also going to be generational differences in privacy concerns. I mean, the fact of the matter is, we have concerns about privacy, but the kids that are going to be driving in 20 years probably are not going to have those same concerns. So a lot of these issues might just go away. So in conclusion, we're not going to have mileage fees anytime soon, all right? There's a lot of issues to be looked at. We're making progress on them. And really, technology is a minor issue. Public acceptance is going to be the biggest hurdle. But maybe in the long term, a lot of these concerns are just going to go away. And I just want to I want to emphasize that it's really difficult to tell what this is going to look like. We don't know what cars are going to look like. We don't know what drivers' expectations are going to be in the long term. So it's just really difficult to speculate. Thank you for your time. We have resources available at that website. If you can write it down real quick, I also have business cards with some information where you can get copies of our reports. We have a listserv where we send out information on mileage fee research. If anybody has any questions after the meeting, I'd be available to talk
Thank you very much.